I'm Professor Wallace. I'm chairman of the International Law Institute, and I want to welcome you all to our program on the Sahel. Those of you who are veterans of this program will know these programs that Yona has a map of the Sahel, and I dare say we will shortly see it. So at this point, Yona, let me turn things over to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Professor Don Wallace. As always, thank you and the ILI and the staff, as well as the other colleagues at the Potomac Institute of Policy Studies for decades-long support of our academic work related to security concerns. Obviously, the various structures that we have, the Inter-University Center for Terrorism Studies, the Inter-University Center for Legal Studies, and Security Through Law, and so on. So again, welcome, as Professor Don Wallace mentioned, to the distinguished invited speakers on the program. So let me begin in the interest of time, first to introduce the program, and then I will make some very brief context, background information. So obviously, following Professor Don Wallace, we have the speakers. First, Professor Jibrin Ibrahim, who was a senior fellow at Center for Democracy and Development in Nigeria. Ambassador Zango Abdu, who is a country manager of the U.S. Institute of Peace in Nigeria, director of the Sahel Institute for Strategic Studies, and former deputy chief of mission at the Nigerian Embassy in Washington. Then we have Professor Yasmine Navi, who is a university professor of humanities and political science at the American International University in Kuwait, and Ambassador Charlie Rave, who is a former U.S. ambassador in Africa and Cambodia and so on. And then we have distinguished commentator, Professor Rita Caldwell, who is distinguished university professor at Maryland and Johns Hopkins and senior fellow at the Potomac Institute for Policy Studies. And then we are also honored to have Dr. Chris Kawaja, who is a professor, associate professor, peace security studies in Nigeria, University of Technology in Yola, and so on. So I will also introduce them before, but if I may, as a moderator, to provide a brief academic context, which is relevant to our studies on Africa, and particularly the Sahel region. Of course, the purpose, as we indicated earlier, is that facing these grave health challenges, Africa is also experiencing the upsurge of other security threats, such as organized criminal activities and terrorism and ungovernable societies. So we have that panel, and I'm going again to invite them in 2 minutes. But first, I just wanted to make sure that, again, as a moderator, who is not from the African region specifically, but rather from the broader Middle East context. In the early 1950s, actually going all the way back, I had the honor to interact with students from African countries and Nigeria and so on at the University of Chicago. And then again, as a participant observer of the Suez War back October 29, 1956, it's 66 years, I can't believe that I was a participant at the time as a youngster at the war, as I mentioned, the UK, France, Israel, that attacked Egypt. We tried to learn the lessons and so on from that time. And then going back to the US and working at the UN research in 1961, I followed the independence movement from colonial time, Africa, to freedom. Again, in the 1960s, we were engaged in academic work related to Africa in the United States and elsewhere. And I just want to mention one or two very important projects. Going back to 1980s, 1983 actually, we had a project on international violence in cooperation with Professor Tunde Adeniran from the University of Ibadan in Nigeria. And we published a major book on international violence around the world, particularly in Africa, in cooperation with the Center for Strategic Studies, Georgetown University at the time, the University of Chicago, and so on. And then later on, focusing on Africa, we had the opportunity to work with US Congress to advise, testify, publish reports, and so forth. Also, in the 1990s, working with international organizations. I'm mentioning all this because I think since 9/11, the 1920s, obviously we try to focus on Africa. And I just want to mention one particular project. This is the investment in Africa that we moved with a bipartisan task force on Africa, recommending some engagement in Africa. And fortunately, we had the leadership of Madeleine Albright at the time, and General Wes Clark, and Ambassador Sue Eisenstadt. So I'm mentioning all this because over the years, we try to deal with these issues, and particularly with the past 3 years, the pandemics. Again, this is the general, background, and I would like to now invite the speakers. And again, in terms of speaking, I think we have obviously the views from the region, from Africa, and then outside the Africa region, and then of course in the United States and elsewhere. So let me first introduce Professor Jibril Ibrahim, who is a senior fellow at the Center for Democracy and Developments, very well-known political scientist who focused on many of these issues for many years in the United States and elsewhere. So welcome, and please proceed with your initial presentation for about 10 minutes. Then we're going to have the other speakers to follow up, and then a Q&A discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thanks for the invitation to be part of this discussion on the security crisis in the Sahel. Just over a month ago, the United Nations, together with the African Union, ECOWAS, established a high-level panel to review the crisis in the Sahel and map out a pathway to recovery and development. This panel, under the leadership of the former Nigerian president, Mahamadou Isuhu, started its work, and I'm one of the experts working with the panel to try to understand where we are on the Sahel. And I'm just coming back from a week of initial discussions. And maybe if there's one lesson I bring back from the initial discussion, is that when we talk about the crisis in the Sahel, it's in reality a crisis of the African states that's unable to govern its territory. And this inability to govern the territory develops responses, and there are consequences which we have been witnessing for some time. The key issue about where we are today is that there is a real existential threat to these states in the Sahel. And the fact of the matter is that the crisis in the Sahel also means a crisis in the Gulf of Guinea countries, as well as a crisis in the Sahara zones. So it's a much larger crisis than the Sahel. But what's specific about the Sahel, and that's really for me the crux of the matter, is that we've had 50 years of very deep crisis to which nobody has responded to in an adequate manner. And this crisis is traced from the 1973 drought, which was a massive shock for the Sahel, and it created repercussions, the results of which we are reaping today. The first is the question of precariousness of life. Life has always been precarious in that zone, but what the drought did in 1973 is that it made it clear the population of the Sahel could no longer survive just in the Sahel. And the question of mobility became a survival issue. And that population of the Sahel started moving massively out from 1973. There are two directions of movements. One direction is south towards the Gulf of Guinea, the countries to the south of the Sahel. The other direction is from the rural hinterland to urban centers. And this led to a massive change in demography, as a significant percentage of the population left their rural habitat and moved out to cities and moved south. And this, of course, massively dislocated family culture, socialization processes, values, and made that population open to all sorts of ideas. And in being open to ideas, what is particularly important in my view is the way it impacted specifically on two institutions, the family and religion. The family became scattered, transmission of values got disturbed, and religion became an open book because people were then open as forms of religious education that had existed underwent this huge shock. Today, what we are seeing in terms of the insecurity in the zone, in particular, the widespread availability of arms, the use of those arms by young people against communities in which they live, against state institutions, and for themselves, is a statement coming from the grandchildren of those who moved out in 1973. And what they're saying is that we finally get it. The state is about the monopoly of arms. These arms have been used against us. These arms have been used to repress us. And there's been an ideology about the use of arms by the state. And that ideology is that it's legitimate. Their conclusion is that it's not legitimate, that they, as victims of decades of marginalization, deserve to consider that they're the ones who need these arms to protect themselves and to advance. And they need these arms to make sure they access what all these others have been accessing over the years. And there's a sense in which, therefore, the nature of the conflict in the Sahel and the way in which arms are used is very much tied to this reconsideration on the nature of the state and the legitimate or illegitimate use of forms of violence. What is, I think, particularly interesting about the current state of the crisis is the way in which there is a real contest over what is the history of the post-colony in the zone of the world. Since independence, the talk has been about development, about democracy, about inclusiveness. That talk is not reflected in the reality of the lives of the people. And the understanding today in much of the Sahel is that the specific history of that zone, with the role of France as a master, working with the local rulers of the Sahelian states, has been some sort of a conspiracy against the people, and that conspiracy has absolutely no legitimacy because it's not about development. And when they talk about democracy, it is not really about democracy. I think the fact that the return of democracy in the post-1990 period created a real change of mentality in terms of what is good for the people. What the people of the Sahel appear to have concluded is that, yes, democracy has come back. Yes, there's multi-party elections. But who are beneficiaries of this return of democracy? And what a lot of them are saying is that when you compare recent history in terms of the reality of the lives of people, there is very little difference between a democratic regime and the previous either military regimes or one-party regimes that ran the tyrannical systems that the whole of our literature has been around about over the past few decades. And that's the context in which I think two major trends emerged. If this democracy is not producing results for the people, then what is the point about resisting coups d'etats or opposing coups d'etats in principle? Because in any case, that democracy is not working. And if it's working, it's not working for the people. The other element has to do about the role of France. I was in Mali in 1992 when the French intervention not 1992, sorry, 2012, when the French intervention happened, when there was this march on Bamako. And what struck me as a Nigerian going to Bamako was this deep and great love for France. The people were carrying French flags, were singing praises of France as a savior, were castigating ECOWAS for its total failure, were dismissing Nigeria, and correctly, for its inability to act as in the heydays when it could intervene in Liberia and Sierra Leone to resolve issues. So France was the answer. Over a decade later, the crisis was not addressed by France. And I think here there's this key factor that's so important in terms of how people apprehend reality in the Sahel, and that's WhatsApp. The messaging on WhatsApp is extremely impactful. And what do you hear and what do you see on WhatsApp? Daily videos of French helicopters supplying arms to terrorists so that they could kill innocent civilians. And that's how France got redefined very clearly as being on the side of the enemy and in fact, of being the worst of the enemies. And it's in that context that the timing of the return of great power rivalry with the war in Ukraine, the battle by Russia to counter the West, and how the Sahel presents an opportunity for Russia to extend this struggle to a new level, brings in very interesting dimensions. And one of the great difficulties of the messaging in the social media today is the great difficulty of distinguishing what is true and what is false, what is contrived propaganda spread for effect, and what is news. And given the context and the choices people have made, given failures in the past, it doesn't really matter whether these things have been fabricated falsely, because it tells the story they want to tell, that for the past 150 years, France has been the enemy. So it's irrelevant even if you can prove a particular video is false. We've had 150 years of French repression. The problem or the difficulty with this situation, therefore, is that the great power rivalry is bound to intensify and deepen this crisis and have an impact on the flow of arms and the way in which arms are used in that region. So my final point in this opening salvo is to make the point that there's a sense in which, for me, democracy was always the answer. But it failed to be the answer because Africa, which had developed a whole new framework of values about plurality, about inclusiveness, about ensuring that policies serve the interests of the people, failed to use democracy to that effect. And it's that failure of the application of democracy that has been reduced to a failure of democracy itself. For me, therefore, there's a huge sense about how understandings and misunderstandings are now huge players in deepening the crisis in the Sahel. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Ibrahim, for the opening statement related to the crisis in the Sahel and the context, which is so important now, particularly looking at the role of the other powers, the Russians that you mentioned, and we would like to obviously get more details related to the mercenaries and other efforts of China and so on and so forth. Again, in the interest of time, I would like to invite your colleague, Ambassador Zango Abdul. Are you there?
I'm here.
Oh, wonderful, wonderful. Welcome again from Abuja. And as I mentioned, obviously, you were instrumental in contributing academically to our work over the years when you served also in the Embassy of Nigeria in Washington. And I want to also thank you very much for your efforts to initiate our work at this time. So would you kindly follow up, Ambassador, with your remarks, and then we'll proceed with other speakers.
Thank you very much. First of all, let me thank Professor Alexander for this wonderful work. In 2012, we had a similar discussion on the Sahel. And today, Professor Jibrin had set the context very well. And I will just only touch on some issues, see what is new from our last discussion, so that we give a lot of room for more discourse on some of the issues raised. In 2012, we looked at the Sahel as a, if you like, a bastion of instability. That has not changed dramatically. If anything, like Professor Juwo highlighted, there is a further deterioration of the existential threats in the Sahel. Second, the crisis is much larger than we thought it is. And it's very interesting the way Professor Jibrin highlighted that when you look at the Sahel and the existential threat, you may think that is something that is spreading across the desert, but it's spreading both southwards and northwards. So it's much larger. The crisis is multidimensional and is becoming a force multiplier. Is creating more instability in the Gulf of Guinea, bringing in more actors. So that's one aspect. Third, I think over the years, the focus has largely been on the different variety of groups, from terrorists, insurgents, bandits, to subnational, others, people with all sorts of ideas, people with irredentist beliefs, people with quasi-national and other ideologies converging to create a crisis. Today, we are seeing more actors in the Sahel. We have seen the metamorphosis of terrorist groups. A large chunk of the focus from 2012 to 2015 has been on Al-Qaeda. Today, we are talking of ISIS in different forms. ISIS in West Africa, ISIS in Greater Sahara, some of the fringe groups from ISIS in the Middle East, all are there, and they are becoming actors. So that's another major issue. Of course, like Professor Juwo highlighted, the more you have these actors and the more if you like, other developments had come to play a key role. The collapse of the Gaddafi regime, the instability in Central Africa, Sudan, have led to proliferation of small arms and light weapons, and making these readily available to the larger youth population. And like Professor Jibo highlighted in one of his write-ups recently, a large youth bulge in the region, a large growing population, particularly the youth, without commensurate economic advantages, making these youth to become more attracted to these instruments of violence. And so they are easily take up these arms against the state. The fourth aspect is another dimension which Professor Jibo raised in the discourse. The whole issue of democracy and development have virtually disappeared in the Sahel region. And dysfunctional democracy has become a major incentive for military intervention. The failure of democracy, the failure of democracy to provide dividends, because that's the general tendency that with democracy, there will be development, there will be rapid expansion of goods and services, rapid expansion of benefits, particularly social services. That has not really been seen in the Sahel region and indeed in most parts of Africa. That failure of democracy to provide that has provided clear justification for military intervention. And recently we have seen that in Guinea, in Mali, and Burkina Faso in rapid succession. And it has become very difficult for ECOWAS, for African Union, and even the global community to make a case for democracy in these countries. We have seen, to the greatest embarrassment of many democrats, how military adventurers have been welcomed and have been cheered into power in some of these countries. So this is a significant development. And I think I totally agree with Professor Jibril. The crisis in the Sahel has provided platform for even new actors to come in. Russia is coming in, and like he said, the growing trend towards superpower rivalry or rivalry between contending powers, France, Russia, the United States, is gradually impacting negatively in trying to address the crisis. Finally, I want to talk about the response, because one of the aspects highlighted in this is what has been the response. To a larger extent, from 2013 to date, there has been moves at the regional level by ECOWAS, by African Union, by the United Nations, by the United States, and in partners with other partners to provide one form of solution to the other. But to a large extent, these interventions have not really yielded much result, largely because of contending interests, sometimes even among the powers. And that's why you find now France is clearly losing the grip in that area. So the recent effort by the Africans, by this initiative, which Professor Jibo is a member, to resuscitate effort towards finding a lasting solution to the crisis in the Sahel is a welcome development. I have a little, I talk with a little caution. I'm cautiously optimistic about the outcome, because without all the key powers and key actors coming together at the regional and the global level, the crisis in the Sahel is a much larger challenge that needs everybody to be on hand. But there seems to be a lot of fatigue on the part of the international community, particularly the leading power, the United States, with so much concentration on Ukraine, the United Nations with so much concentration on the vast challenges in terms of poverty, disease, climate change, to see whether they could provide. But nonetheless, it is a step in the right direction. So I'll stop here and give room for more intervention. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ambassador Zango. Obviously, all your points are on the mark, and obviously we have to deal with the wider consequences related to the crisis, whether it's human rights or refugees or energy or whatever it is. We'll come back to it later on. So again, in the interest of time, for the initial statement, I would like to invite, as we mentioned before, Professor Yasmine Hasnaoui, who is a specialist in North Africa. She's based now in Kuwait, as I mentioned, but she also served in the United States, in Washington, and elsewhere, teaching on the Maghrebs in Sahara and everything else. So I would like to invite Yasmine to make an initial statement.
Thank you, Professor Yona, for inviting me to be part of this timely conversation, along with these, distinguished, seasoned experts. I would like first to, contextualize the moment. We are living, as Dr. Jibreen, Professor Jibreen and Professor Abdu rightly put it, we're living the security landscape has taken a new turn across Africa, and specifically the Sahel region. The African continent, with approximately 30 million kilometers squares spread across 54 countries, had been the stage for the last decade of permanent structural violence, with 48% of the victims of terrorism in the world being African. Terrorism in Africa has cost the continent around $171 billion in the past year, but the region's crises have drifted further from the public spotlight, with considerable media attention prioritizing the war in Ukraine, as again Professor Abdu rightly put it. Across the continent, the ISIS continue to exploit the conflict, continue to exploit governance failure, political turmoil, socioeconomic inequalities, and grievances to attract followers and resources, as well as to incite and organize terrorist threats. These are, I would say, the main security and threats we face today in Africa, and no region is spared from these security challenges that we are going to talk about today. The Sahel, Lake Chad Basin, Somalia, Eastern DRC, and Mozambique, where there are terrible terrorist acts, and even beyond in other regions in North Africa, where we witness terrorist groups in connivance with, some militias, the Polisario, for instance, that keeps targeting Sahrawis, who became a breeding ground for, ISIS recruiters and traffickers of all kind. So I will add another challenge that I believe we witness in Africa are the ongoing hostilities and food insecurity that got even worse with the Ukraine and Russia war. And this is also fueled by both armed conflict and climate change that have forced, millions of, citizens to flee their homes in various countries within the Sahel and other parts in Africa, but not only the Sahel regions. For instance, I've been following a little bit deeply what is happening in the Sahel. For instance, in Burkina Faso, that currently now finds itself in a very devastating state due to the armed conflicts. The country has indeed been confronted with the presence of various organizations, as you rightly again put it, Professor Abdu, the Athos, which caused thousands of civilians to flee their homes in 2021. We also have seen even worse in Mali following the withdrawal of some forces from Mali, which left foreign forces in Mali, which left an open window that is being now covered by the Russian mercenary groups, which further threatens the security situation in the regions. Violence against civilians increased and in number and severity since the Wagner arrival in December 2021. I think the interests of the Wagner Group, and I insist here that are clear, and the settlements in Africa are just, the beginning. Thus, these withdrawals from foreign forces, whether they were right or wrong, I think it only poses a change of policy in Mali, but a risk of instability and security, whilst opens opportunities for countries outside the scope of Western values. Currently, the ongoing main international mission in Mali is the MINUSMA. The European Union counts on 2 executive missions that fall under the common security and defense policy. And you have other forces that are present in the region. I would like also to highlight another point that I see worth mentioning. The Sahel is not only there is not only a threat of terrorism, but also there is at the core of the harsh reality of climate change. With over 70% of the population in the Sahel dependent, on agriculture, pastoralism as the primary source of income, the climate change has indeed contributed to the driving existent socioeconomic and political tensions that further escalated the conflict. Last year, for instance, Nigeria worked with Ireland to co-author draft thematic resolutions on climate change and security, and brought it to vote to the Security Council at the end of 2021. But unfortunately, this draft resolution failed to adopt, with Russia and India to cast a negative vote. So links between climate and security are, I think, something very important to take into consideration. We know that certain socioeconomic conditions are kind of a push factor for radicalization, such climate risks and unequal access to natural resources. So I think that despite efforts from interregional, international agencies that have been fully engaged combating terrorism in the Sahel, we see that there is still many challenges and pitfalls. The G5 Sahel joints face several challenges. Financial issues and limited military capacity, I would say, remain the main obstacles. There is also a given shortage of resources, and roughly around 5,200 strong counter-terrorism joint force. They still lack capacity limits to what it can actually accomplish. Also, Mali's departure from the regional Sahel organization is also another challenge to combat terrorism. Another crucial challenge is the deficit in intergovernmental and interagency collaboration in fighting this phenomenon. I think that the nature and dynamics of this threat call for a more of a dual whole of a government and whole of society approach. And I think that the international community must remain united in its commitment, something that we don't see anymore, to stamp out the scourge of terrorist organizations such as the Athos, ISIS, Al-Shabaab, and you name them. The military and security-led responses alone will not lead to sustainable solution, but they can be part of a tactical response in the short term, creating the localized stability necessary for trade and economic activities to become established. I think that the youth, and as Professor Ibrahim stated, he talked about the importance of youth and how they took this ideology. I think the sprawling youth population in the Sahel, which counts for 65% under the age of 25, makes the region an extraordinarily vibrant and youthful expanse with unlimited potential for progress and sustainable development. I think that Africa is indeed the continent of the future, and the Sahel is a model for that future. And I think that all stakeholders must come together, not only talk about fighting terrorism, but also invest in youth. And they must come together to unlock the opportunities for the region has to offer by increasing economic development, by increasing education and employment opportunities, and finally bring that mantra, African solutions to African problems, to reality. And I'm going to stop here, and I look forward to the discussions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Yasmine, for outlining the nature and intensity of the threat, covering so many areas that we're going to obviously return to them later on, all the way from the climate change dangers, as you mentioned, environmental, and so on and so forth. And the bottom line, obviously, is what kind of response strategies the African themselves, with the support of the international community, can somehow reduce the risks and bring it under some manageable levels. With that, I would like to move on to our next colleague, Ambassador Charlie Ray, as I mentioned, who is a colleague for many years, and we certainly appreciate many of his contributions to our academic work. He obviously brings extensive diplomatic, military, educational, I think, activities. In Africa, he also served as an ambassador to Zimbabwe, and also served in Sierra Leone, and of course elsewhere in Asia, in Cambodia and Thailand and China. I would like to mention also his very important military role, because he served for 2 decades in the US Army in Vietnam and so on, and his educational and journalistic, I think, experience is very useful. So we would like to invite him to bring his interdisciplinary, I might say, experience related to Africa and other regions.
Thank you, and thanks for allowing me to join this distinguished panel. I have been listening with very interest in what's been said, and really have not very much that I can add, other than to say that I would sort of like to talk about the security situation in the Sahel from an outsider's point of view, as someone who's had extensive experience in security, both from a military and from a diplomatic standpoint. As I look at the Sahel, in listening to the previous speakers, I heard a lot of what I have observed, and the Sahel experiences the same problems that the rest of Africa experiences, only more so because of its uniqueness. I mean, this strip of territory that lies between the Sahara and the Savannah is really sort of a textbook case of all of the how complex problems can be. Starting with the fact that you have so many countries that need to coordinate with each other in order to address these very complex problems, that have not been able to address their own border issues. You have people living in border areas where there is really little or no government presence. It's been alluded to, the youth bubble. More than 60% of the people of the Sahel are under 25, which makes them younger than even the rest of Africa, which is younger than the rest of the world. The Sahel is the poorest part of Africa. It's the fastest growing part. You have a rate of population growth that's far greater than the rest of the continent. And it's also the part that is that is most severely impacted by climate change. And when you combine all of these demographic factors with the climate change impact, you've got a recipe for violence. You have the competition for land between herders and farmers that causes violence. You have criminal networks operating in these areas where the governments exercise no control, and in looking at this issue of whether democracy works, and so the military takes over. If you look at the history of this region, the military takeovers have not addressed any of these issues that have caused the instability. And in one case, I believe recently, a military takeover was then kicked out by another group of military who accused them of not solving these complex problems. And part of it is because I don't think, as people look at it, they really see just how complex. Dr. Hasanoui, if I mispronounce your name, I apologize, hit it, is that it requires a whole of society, whole of government, whole of people effort, because there's no single reason or answer. I mean, I mentioned the demographics. You have to address the problem of food security, of economic well-being, government presence, whether it's a military government, whether it's a civilian dictatorship, or whether it's a democracy. If people in a border area don't see the government until there's a problem and a few soldiers swoop in, burn a few houses and leave, you have a bigger problem. And until the countries, until the societies, until the regional groupings in Africa and the international community start looking at the situation in the Sahel not as simply a how do we deal with violent extremism and terrorism, but how do we address all of the issues: overpopulation, lack of food security, lack of a sense of security in home. I mean, if you don't see the government, then the government is, you don't trust the government. It doesn't matter whether the government's wearing a pinstripe suit or a uniform. And in fact, my experience in dealing with these issues is that the military governments tend to get greater blowback for this than the civilian governments, because in the civilian cases, it's neglect. In the military cases, it's quite often actions taken that directly impact and hurt people in these border areas. So we really have to the international community, the regional groupings in Africa, ECOWAS, AU, and others need to sit down and start looking at this problem holistically. It's not enough to remove ISIS from the board, because if you don't address the problem of government services to people, of governments providing security to people, food security and economic well-being, you just replace one terrorist group, one extremist group, or one criminal group with another. And so as I said, I'm speaking as an outsider, and of course, this, I think that someone said this has to be an African solution to these problems, and I couldn't agree more. I think one of the issues the international community has to grapple with is when we go into these countries, we need to go in a listening mode and find out what the people there think they need, rather than swoop in and tell them what we're bringing to them. And with that, I will stop and hear what someone else has to say. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Charlie, for your insights. And as an outsider, but also insider, spent time in Africa, and obviously you covered a great deal. We'll come back to it. Now I would like to move on to invite our colleague, Professor Rita Caldwell, as a commentator, to make some comments. Obviously, as I mentioned, she is well known around the world as one of the foremost scientists focusing on global infectious diseases, water issues, health, and so on. And for years, she worked to address the emerging infectious diseases, water issues, which relates also to Africa, of course. And I think that she brings great deal of knowledge, and we have to follow her science. So, Professor Caldwell, please.
Thank you, Yona, and thank you for the speakers who presented some fascinating and very important information. I am not an expert on the Sahel, so I'm not going to try to comment except to offer some observations. First of all, I'd like to comment on the kind of technological assistance that can be provided and give examples where we're now working, at least my team is working in Yemen, Ethiopia, and soon to be expanding to Mozambique and Senegal, as well as the Congo. And that is in providing prediction of cholera. And we use satellite sensing. And we use the satellites that are not classified, but that have been released for public application. And over the last 40 years, having developed the data set that the incidence of cholera, for example, is a major disease that strikes Africa and the populations for the very reasons you have all described: overpopulation, lack of resources, lack of access to safe water. But by the computational modeling and the satellite sensing, we've been able to provide a 6 to 8 week prediction of risk of cholera. And we began this work in Africa in 2017 during the time of the Yemen outbreak, which was a disaster because of the strife. Cholera was the worst ever recorded. What we did was a retrospective analysis and found that indeed, with the computational model and satellite sensing, simply by oversight, that is satellite observation, we were able to confirm that we could predict cholera. So in 2018, we joined up with the British Aid Agency, the UNICEF, and we were able to provide this 6 to 8 week warning as to where and when the highest risk of cholera would occur. That allowed the British Aid Agency, the UN agencies, and then to locate precisely where the supplies, medical supplies, personnel, water supplies would be most effective. And in fact, we were able to reduce cholera in 2018 significantly. So we have continued to provide that kind of prediction for the country. And while doing the analyses, we got signals that there would be an outbreak in Sudan. And sure enough, cases occurred 6 or 8 or 10 weeks later. So we now do these kinds of analyses expanding for the UN. This is sort of a technological assistance. Now let me turn to another aspect of the work that we're involved in. In fact, my team right now is in Ghana in a meeting in Accra with the Ghanaian Minister of Health. If there's a conference underway and representatives from NASA, my team is present, and from a group called the Safe Water Network, which is headquartered in New York, but it's actually operated in Ghana. And what is really important and critical is that this is a capacity of providing safe drinking water to communities in Ghana and extrapolatable to the rest of Africa. This is done not by going in, building a unit and then leaving, just the opposite. What we have done starting a decade, actually 2 decades ago, is to go into the country to given locales, for example, in Accra, finding local individuals with business training, developing a business model, hiring locals, training, and then providing the technology. It's really just a unit that can be operated, can be installed and operated, that provides safe drinking water. You bring water in from wells or ponds or the river. It is treated and then can be distributed, and it's costed so that the price is something in the order of a few cents per 20 liters. And it is with some funding provided, we can actually make it free to those who have no money at all. But the whole point is not to make it free, but to have it to be able to maintain within the community by the individuals in the community, and then have it freestanding. We now have several hundred units in Ghana, and we provide safe water, or they provide for themselves safe water for 2 or 3 million people. And this is I think this approach, one being the technological, which you can provide the information, the assistance, without actually having to intervene and to take over the operations. And in the other instance, with the Safe Water Network, you're building capacity, a local capacity, which I think is really critical, and which I think because it's been so successful in Ghana, we've begun some work in India as well. And there in Uttar Pradesh, it's been significantly successful that the government of that unit of Uttar Pradesh has actually contracted with Safe Water Network to build the capacity there for providing safe water. So the discussion today is really critical, because the description of what is happening at the present time is really both frightening and threatening. Threatening for democracy, threatening globally. But the approaches that I think we can take in this instance for provision of safe water, of course, with climate change, there may not be any water to be made safe, but I think with the operation of being able to utilize where the water is available and to utilize it in a way that it actually can be recycled, but locally operated, locally owned, and building the capacity as we have done, where these units are within a given radius, but if you locate units, as we have done, in proximity, you can actually cover a lot of territory, a lot of ground, with individual self-operated business control and operation of the units. So the bottom line of the thinking, as I've listened to these very important discussions, is that we need to look at what we're doing quite differently. And philanthropy hasn't worked. And finding a way to create local control, local operation, local responsibility, I think is the approach that we should put more effort into. With your experience, when I say you, all of the speakers today may have examples where this has been tried and hasn't worked, but let's analyze if it hasn't worked, why. And if there is a way then to provide a model for operation, that would be one very important outcome from this discussion. So those are my thoughts. A bit rambling, but actually rooted in experience and with data. So thank you for the opportunity to share my thoughts and ideas with you.
Thank you very much, Rita, for your insight and experience and guidance. We certainly would welcome also your opinions related to the next generation of scientists and health providers in Africa during maybe the discussion. I would like to move on to our speaker again from Nigeria, Professor Chris Kawaja, as I mentioned before, who contributed a great deal of research to many of the issues that were raised today in his publications internationally, the United States and Europe and Africa. So with that, Professor Chris Kawaja, are you there?
I'm here.
Okay.
Thank you very much, Professor Yona, and good evening to all the participants. I know it's afternoon in the US. I think Professor Jibrin Ibrahim laid a very important foundation and provided some very specific context to what we are dealing with when it comes to the situation in the Sahel. What I will do quickly is to just draw attention to some of the mega trends that were not captured in the conversation. And I think at the recent high-level meeting that took place in New York, the Secretary General of the United Nations drew attention to the very important point about the role that non-state actors are increasingly playing in the Sahel and how that is also having huge implications for security and governance within the Gulf of Guinea area. And when you stretch that to North Africa as well as the Lake Chad area, you begin to appreciate the context within which the entire African continent is situated when it comes to a conversation of this nature about the kind of response mechanisms that should be put in place with respect to dealing with the governance and security issues within the Sahel. And I think one major manifestation of that increased and dominant role that non-state actors are playing is the mercenary incursion in the Sahel, in the context also of the Wagner Group, the Russian-based Wagner Group. And I currently represent Africa on the UN Working Group on Mercenaries, and our mandate is simply to monitor the activities of mercenaries across the world and also undertake country visits to many of the countries where issues of this nature are becoming of utmost concern to the United Nations. Mali is one of the countries we have flagged, and the role that the Wagner Group is playing in Mali today, beyond just being a mercenary outfit, in a way, Russia is also using the presence of the Wagner Group in Mali as part of its own way of expanding its security interests in Africa. And we all know from the days of the executive outcome in the past and other mercenary groups, the extent to which many of these actors can also be used by countries to advance their own security interests. And this is one area of concern that we also need to look at in the context of the absence of a legally binding instrument that guides the activities of mercenaries across the world. When mercenaries operate in an opaque manner in countries that are fragile, where national level rules are not even present to checkmate their activities, what becomes of them when it comes to the issue of human rights violations, when it comes to the issue of the unconstitutional change of government? We are seeing coup d'etats, Burkina Faso, Guinea. We also witnessed the death of Idris Deby in Chad. Till date, there has not been any concrete discussion about how Idris Deby died. Are there, what is the role of foreign actors in that context? And if at all there are, who are they? And what interests were they trying to achieve with the death of Idris Deby and the emergence of his son as the head of Shah? That is one example of what the role rebel groups can play in fueling and also perpetuating insecurity in the context of fragile settings such as Chad and other countries within the African continent. The drying up of the Lake Chad is of importance when discussing the Sahel. Yes, it's within the Lake Chad, but Sahel also has a very strong connection with the Lake Chad area. Countries such as Nigeria have been pushing for the recharging of the Lake Chad for quite some time, but not much has been done in pushing that agenda forward. The Lake Chad is home to millions of people who rely on that particular area as a source of livelihood. Not much has been done. The population displacement as a result of Boko Haram and the activities of other groups, the population displacement as a result of the activities of rebels in Mali, Burkina Faso, and other countries within the Sahel area also have huge implications for migration in the context of how transnational crimes and instability also begin to hold many of these countries siege. Because when you look at border controls within the ECOWAS region, they are very weak, partly because of the existing protocol on the free movement of persons and goods, and that protocol has in a way also aided the movement of even criminal groups, because they take advantage of this permission that they get in terms of free movement to also undertake or engage in some criminal activities within the region. So this is one area that is of interest. And beyond the issue of migration within Europe and North America, the Sahel and the entire Africa should be an area of focus in terms of how we're able to monitor the movements of people within the continent, all in the name of insecurity, but that as they move from one country due to insecurity, they become causes and sources of insecurity in other countries where they move. And Libya presents an important example of that. With the fall of Gaddafi, we saw the movement of people, we saw the movement of arms, and many of them have aided and continue to sustain pre-existing conflicts in other countries such as Nigeria, Chad, Mali, Burkina Faso. And I think that is one key area of focus. My last point is that the agenda that we should look out for, and I think Professor Ibrahim raised that point when he talked about the pathway to recovery and development. The Sustainable Development Goals represent one of the key pathways through which the Sahel can be helped, the Sahel can be salvaged, but you need governance for security to make sense. Leadership is very central to whatever conversation we'll be having on security, because even if you develop the security plan or the agenda for recovery, if leadership is not given or prioritized in the context of the kind of individuals and groups that are trusted with power, we will only be experiencing a cyclical movement or change of these individuals who continue to move from one point to the other, while the ordinary Sahelians continue to suffer under the yoke of these individuals that are really, really not concerned about development. Unfortunately, while they are here ruling, their kids are out there in Europe and North America going to school. But the schools here, the health system here, the public amenities that they are supposed to enjoy are collapsing, while their own families are having a field day over there with the resources that are supposed to be used to develop the region. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Kawanja. I certainly would like to get your views on some other issues such as the privatization of security and so on, but we'll come back to that. At this point, as the moderator, if I may, I would like to invite our speakers to begin a Q&A discussion among themselves. We, of course, heard the views from the region itself and from other wider regions. But I think the discussion, the Q&A discussion among the speakers and commentators would be quite useful initially, and later on we can invite, in the interest of time, if possible, some of the selected participants who joined us, some of our colleagues and students and interns in the United States and internationally. So with that, I would like to invite Professor Ibrahim first to make some comments at this point.
Thank you. I think we've had a very good spread about the various dimensions that characterize the crisis in the Sahel. And I want to agree in particular with the emphasis that has been placed on demographic changes, the youth bulge, and the rise of non-state actors, because there's a sense in which that is really the core of the problem. Professor Kwaja has raised the issue of the circulation of small arms and light weapons. In Nigeria today, we are talking about 6 million arms in the hands of non-state actors. And what this does is that it changes the situation completely, because the Nigerian state and its armed forces do not have that quantity of arms under their own control. And that's why it becomes a battle both about the survival of the state and about the recreation of a new situation. And the question about the recreation of a new situation is whether that would be the state of nature that Hobbes will talk about, or new groups coming up to control the state. My sense really, with all these issues that have been raised and about the specific role of climate change as a factor in the Sahel, and that's why I started with the 1973 drought. You see, in 2009, when Boko Haram arose around the Lake Chad Basin and the 4 countries around it, that was when governments in the region started talking about the Lake Chad losing 80% of its water surface. When did Lake Chad lose 80% of its water surface? It lost it in 1973 to 1975. That's almost 50 years ago. But precisely because you don't have governance, there's nobody anticipating problems that are being generated. Nobody is planning responses to those problems being generated. Then, when the crisis explodes in front of all our faces, that's when people suddenly start realizing, oh, the Lake Chad has dried up. And Nigeria in particular started talking about that in 2010. Where was the Nigerian government in 1973 to 75 when that happened? And this is really my key point, that there's a sense in which it's a governance challenge. You have institutions that don't perform the role those institutions are supposed to perform. Institutions are not just structures. They are structures that are supposed to perform specific functions. So when you have those structures that exist as formal entities, but in terms of outcomes, they do not perform those functions, then what it means is that you don't really have functional institutions. And there's a sense in which there's a real challenge before the Sahel. I'm glad we haven't focused so much on Libya. I mean, it did come up, but for too long, I've been a bit pissed off about the way in which everything is, oh, Gaddafi fell and arms circulated. And I'm glad about, I don't remember who made the comment, that part of the whole history of the Sahel has been the existence of criminal groups and trafficking throughout the past 100 years plus. And that therefore, these circuits have existed, they've prospered, they've found ways of sustaining themselves. And if today you have 6 million arms circulating in the hands of non-state actors in Nigeria, it's because those circuits are sufficiently developed, advanced, and capable today to provide that amount, that quantity of arms and confront the state in a real war about who actually controls power. One of the points I'd want to make is that for too long, we've focused too much, I think, on the religious dimension of the crisis, in the sense that a lot of the terrorist groups are very much influenced by jihadist ideologies and have placed that jihadi ideology as the central motivating factor for their action. But the studies we are doing currently on the rise of terrorism and its impact on Nigeria is showing that the jihadists are now a minority in terms of these non-state actors, that the majority are now simply criminal bands who have had a history of very negative relationship with the state, suffered from abuse by state actors, lost, a lot of them who are pastoralists have lost a significant part of their herd, and are simply now acting as people who have come to the realization that possession of the Kalashnikov creates a huge change in their situation. They can use it against their neighbors. They can use it against the communities they belong to. They can use it against the state and its actors. And above all, if those who have historically been in control of the state have used that control to acquire wealth for themselves, their personal aggrandizement, they too can acquire that wealth and start building their fortunes and enjoy what those who had hitherto been in control of the state have been enjoying. And this makes it a very difficult issue to address, because in terms of jihadi actors, there are things you can do in terms of de-radicalization, in terms of mobilizing communities to realize the weak ideological justification for those actions within the doctrine of Islam itself, etc. But when you have more and more actors who are not bound by any ideological guidance, but are acting as free actors who have realized the pathway to wealth is the Kalashnikov, they've acquired it, and they're on their way, then it becomes much more difficult to handle, especially for Sahelian societies, where precariousness of life is the major factor, and that the percentage of the population living in extreme poverty is extremely high. The fact of the matter is that in most of the Sahel, you are talking of 50, 60, 70% of the population living in extreme poverty, and therefore have nothing to lose in terms of the activities it engages in, and suddenly realizing this docility we have shown over the decades via state actors is what has created the conditions for our terrible lives of misery to continue, and that the time has come for that life of misery to change, and let's start enjoying what the others have been enjoying, because they had control of the security forces, because they could treat people how they wanted, and because nobody could question what they were doing in terms of governance, and above all, what they were not doing in terms of governing their countries. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Ibrahim. I would like to invite Ambassador Abdul to make some comments at this point.
Thank you so much. Listening to Professor Jibril and then the wonderful intervention by Dr. Yasmine leaves me with so much pessimism about the future in the Sahel. The cocktail of challenges is just so much. And in the short term, the future looks very bleak and very uncertain. And I think they made the key point, both Professor Jibril and Dr. Yasmine. At the core of the challenges in the Sahel is the issue of governance. And when you look at the concept of ungovernable space, there is nowhere in the world that typifies that concept, not even Afghanistan, than the Sahel. If you look at some of the states, Burkina Faso, Mali, the state is largely losing the territory of control. When you go to Mali outside Bamako, a couple of maybe 100 kilometers, by the time you reach Timbuktu, is territory completely taken over by bandits, Islamists, jihadists, criminals, and all those. This is the same story when you go to Burkina Faso, large chunk of Guinea, the south, parts of Chad, and even some parts of Nigeria. So really, we need to really address these challenges. And it, like Dr. Yasmine highlighted, it involves a cocktail of actions at both the state, sub-regional, regional, and continental level. The more the global community ignores the challenges in the Sahel, the more they find themselves in more difficult situation. We don't want to have another Afghanistan in the corner of Africa because like the University Center branded the Sahel is an arc of instability stretching from the Sahara right to the Mediterranean. The earlier we realize this major challenge, the better. And I think Dr. Kwaja highlighted that this situation is proliferating. Governance is collapsing. Nobody is doing anything about that. And the states are gradually becoming completely incapable of holding the center. And state failure has manifested in several ways, such that the space is now taken over by criminals. So it is very important, I think, to emphasize this, and like Professor Jibril highlighted also, when the youth and the rest see it as a kind of, it's our turn, it's a time for revenge, it's become even more complicated. So it's really a very complex situation that requires short, medium, and long term. And I think the intervention by Dr. Yasmine has highlighted some of these things, but it really involves the result of the international community. The fatigue in terms of focus and attention, and I think the Dr. Kwaja highlighted how the Secretary General tried to highlight the issue in the Sahel and indeed the larger part of the continent of Africa, the proliferation of conflict. The earlier we address this, the better. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Abdul. I would like to invite Professor Hasnawi, please, for your comments.
Thank you so much, Professor Yona. I think that listening to distinguished speakers, I think we all agree on important things. We agree that in spite of government efforts, whether interregional, whether international, the security situation is just getting worse. It is deteriorated, and I'm sorry to give this bleak, image, but this is the truth. I think that we all agree that not only security matters, these intervention matter, but also ensuring peace. We have to tackle the development program. We have to say that a purely security approach is not enough. There should be a broad development program that will be needed to transform economies, increasing the living standard, and give youth give young people hope. And I think this is very important. And I was very I would say moved by the first talk of the first speaker, who was speaking about youth. He was speaking that he was saying that these youth take arms because they see the terrorists taking arms. That's really something that needs to be addressed. And I think that this solution should not only come from international. We should not, as Africans, We should not wait for, the international interventions. I think that solution must also be African, must also come from locals, nationals, and regional stakeholders, assisted by external partners as needed. I think that the situation is worsening with these mercenaries being in Africa. We're gonna blame France. We may blame France for whatever things it did, but I think that now things are worsening with these mercenaries from Russia. We'll see other mercenaries from China, etc. So I think that the perception of the region must also change, and there should be an integrated approach that includes, among other things, building institutions, promoting youth jobs creation and human rights. Only through, I think, targeted collective efforts that don't create conflict of remit can be the desired results to be achieved. So this is, I believe, that's something that the community needs to talk about, more development, and not only focus on ensuring security, because I believe that youth, women are the future in Africa, the elderly as well. And I think we have to put our hands together to bring something to the African continent, because it is very heartening to see people dying on a daily basis, people crossing borders as if they think that Europe or US will give them something, whereas in Africa, it's their future. It is Africa that can give them something, that can give to these people something. So I think that, and also I kind of blame sometimes when I see some resolutions that don't pass, like, for example, that the resolution that was co-authored by Nigeria and Ireland on climate change that did not pass, for the reason that some of the countries that cast the negative voice automatically said, oh, because the Security Council is not a place to pass this resolution. I feel sorry to hear about these issues. I think that there should be a responsibility of the international community, that they have to be aware that this is a bomb that can just explode anytime, anywhere. It had started, but it might lead to very, very dangerous effects. I think I'm all set for now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Yasmine, again, for your views, particularly the role of these different segments of the society to be involved, the youth and the women and so on. So I would like to move on again to our Ambassador Charlie Ray for your comments.
Thanks, Jonah. My grandmother taught me that when it's already been said, well, don't try to re-say it. I think that the speakers before me have really covered the points that need to be addressed to deal with the security situation in the Sahel quite effectively. It's been amazing to hear them speak, and so with that, I will just say, keep doing what you're doing, and thanks for including me.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Ray. Professor Rita Caldwell, any last comments?
Listening to the speakers, it reinforces my conviction that it's important to develop governance, not at the top, but in the community. And I think when there is, as we have observed in our work in Ghana and elsewhere in Africa, when the local community, the people themselves are in charge, things operate. It's when the external forces move in, it seems, from what I'm hearing, and I'm listening very intently, that the fracturing and rupturing of society is occurring. So I think if we could find ways to empower the local communities, the individual systems, the youth, the women, then we can save Africa from itself. That's my comment.
Okay, thank you very much for your insights again. Dr. Chris Kawaja?
Yeah, thank you very much. And I think it's been a wonderful session with this array of personalities, bringing in varied perspectives to the conversation. One point I want to just add quickly is that in the midst of this crisis of governance and security that we are talking about, is the whole question of resilience. How are people, communities responding to existential issues around their everyday survival? And I think it's in this context that we also appreciate the disconnect between the state and the citizens, because the citizens no longer have confidence in the state and its institutions, and in response, they are living their lives with this notion that we are not expecting anything from the state. But there is a limit to which resilience can also be implemented by these communities. And that is why going back to the question of how do we get the state to be alive to its own primary responsibility of protection and provision. And this is what a meeting of this nature, consistent research and advocacy will do to helping the Sahel and the African continent in general. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Professor Dan Wallace, at this time, would you kindly make some comments or any questions of the speakers and commentators?
Okay, Yona, well, Charlie Ray is right. We shouldn't repeat what others have said. This has been an excellent panel, as often, as always. I've just returned from South Africa a few weeks ago, and I spent a lot of time in East Africa, and I've been fairly active in one or two Western African countries. And I would say, if you look at Africa, it's 55 countries plus. There's a lot to be encouraged by. I think the Sahel and the countries that have been described today, maybe they, quite frankly, what I've heard is very discouraging. And I think Professor Ibrahim, in his various remarks, has put his finger on sort of several cores, and others have picked that up. I mean, there's been a real breakdown in many Sahel countries for many reasons. I mean, the families are broken down, endless displacement. So, I mean, traditions are destroyed. And people point out that the state doesn't exist. I agree with Rita that one wants to do things at a local level. But if there's no framework, no state, it's not going to be sufficient. And I say it, and then you hear, of course, all of the consequences of the breakdown. You know, the private groups, the arms, etc., the people who exploit. But that happens everywhere. It's a question of degree. But I think it's particularly bad, quite frankly, in the Sahel countries, as described. And what is the answer? What is to be done and who's to do it? I'm not very clear. I mean, we know what the usual answers are. Of course, you want to involve people who are not involved, youth, women, etc. I don't think it's going to be sufficient. I don't think the international community externally can do much. They certainly have to do something. I honestly don't know, but it strikes me that the situation is sort of unacceptably desperate in many of the Sahel countries, which is not the case in all of Africa, quite frankly. So I think we shouldn't generalize about the whole continent, but I do think we really have to work. And I was very interested in the point made, I think, by Jibril Ibrahim, that it's no longer the jihadist push which creates the security problem. That's almost a detail within the general breakdown in which all sorts of pathologies exist. I mean, I suppose we have to do is collect sort of the best sorts of brains we've heard today, but where you begin, my guess is, and I don't know these countries well, you can't take all countries at once. Maybe you take the few where there's a bit more hope and begin to organize around them. but it's certainly been the most enlightening discussion, Yona, but I would say, quite frankly, somewhat discouraging. And Yona knows I'm a great optimist, as does Charlie. So there we are. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. So we have a few more minutes. So my question, the bottom line question, I think, again, relates not only to the past lessons, going all the way back to maybe King Solomon, when he said that nothing is new under the sun, or the Zulu famous proverb that what already happened will happen again. But to look at the future, the unknown, the mystery. In other words, there are those who believe that the worst is yet to come, and whether civilization in Africa and elsewhere will survive. And I wonder whether the speakers and panelists have any glimpse into the future in terms of what might happen, or we're going to repeat history.
Maybe the point I'd want to make is that 30 minutes before we started this conversation, the African Union mediators were able to sign an agreement between Ethiopia and its rebel region to sign a ceasefire after 2 years of war. And maybe that's encouraging, because we know the history of wars in Ethiopia. You continue fighting till you completely annihilate the enemy. But if Ethiopia today is finding itself in a situation where after 2 years of just mass killing and suffering, that maybe they have to think of a negotiated settlement, is a good sign. When we met last week in Niamey to discuss about the work of the high-level panel on the Sahel, maybe the key issue that arose is that the breakdown we are talking about is because those with responsibility for governance failed. It was African leaders that decided among themselves that nobody should have more than two terms in office. They started breaking that agreement. They had an agreement about zero tolerance for change of government through unconstitutional means. They started breaking that. They had an agreement on genuine support for multi-party democracy. They started manipulating elections. So when people said democracy failed, it's actually those in charge of running democratic regimes that failed. But there's a sense in which, for me, what's important is trying to reorient the mentality towards enlightened self-interest. I live in Abuja, and over the past 4 or 5 days, when the United States and the United Kingdom issued an advisory that there will be a major attack by terrorists in Abuja, and asked their citizens to start withdrawing from this city. And I see members of Nigeria's ruling class, and you can see fright in their eyes, that these people who are out there in the villages, out there in the country, causing havoc, now they are able to attack us in Abuja, where we are enjoying ourselves. That's really the issue on the table. And that the threat of survival for everybody is now on the table. And in that context, It's either the state gives up the ambition to survive, or it starts opening up to really negotiate a new social contract with citizens. Because what we are confronting is the total loss of public trust in the state and a breakdown of the social contract between citizens and the state. And if that issue is not addressed, then I think the whole world is in for a big problem. My final word on Nigeria, and I think it's just something to reflect about. For 40 years, the Nigerian state has survived on the basis of petroleum rent. In the last 4 or 5 years, it's no longer able to get that petroleum rent for the simple reason that most of the petrol produced in Nigeria today is stolen and goes to private pockets. And the state that was so dependent on that petroleum rent is now unable to function because it has basically no source of revenue. So when the crisis reaches that point, is either you move towards complete anarchy, or you start taking measures to rebuilding trust and the social contract between citizens and the state. And my sense is that what the Sahel is telling its inhabitants today is that we've reached that point. Gangsterism takes over completely, in which case for a country like Nigeria, we are going to produce maybe 120 million to 130 million refugees that will head for United States of America and Europe, or we start fixing things and then we can continue to stay here. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your observations. And I would like to mention that those of you who participated in this very enlightening discussion, we will have a video for viewing to a larger audience. And as you know, we're preparing also a report that is based on your presentations and discussion, and we'll be in touch with you. At this point, I personally would like to thank you for your efforts and support in developing this very useful discourse, and we'll stay in touch. I would like to ask our colleague, Professor Don Wallace, to make closing remarks.
You want my last words? Well, it's thank you. Thank you to everyone, and thank you to Yona. And hopefully we can have some more of these sessions about the Sahel, quite frankly. And again, thank you.
Thank you very much. Be well.
Thank you very much, Prof. We'll talk over the weekend. Thank you so much. It's been a great evening. Bye.
Great.
Bye-bye.
Dr.
Bye.
Bye. Bye.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.